it's definitely brakes on the car, isn't it? You know, which is helpful, but the car is still polluting.
But the golden age of capitalism was actually 1950 to about 1972. No banking, very minimal number of banking crises. Economic growth was slow but steady every single year, year on year on year on year. It grew, and that's that baby boomer generation went through all of that, and then it all got privatized. And so the economy booms, and then it crashes, booms and crashes. And we've had more banking crashes in 10 years after they lifted the gold standard and moved away from that internationally. In like every decade than there was in that entire like 50-year period. Like that 30-year period. It was really strange. Like we did that. So there's obviously, I think regulation, without it, can you imagine? I mean, we'd be still selling people in the slave market.
Yeah. Okay, everyone can find their seats. We shall continue. Start off with your next leading on. What? Start with agency structure. Okay. So on to the perhaps the actual future, and in a hopefully optimistic way.
I love the nod to me. That's nice.
If we just leap off your what you mentioned right before we ended about agency and structure, and that is kind of a dichotomy that we often hear about, like personal choice, or is this a system that's pushing us? But you say this dichotomy is almost a bit problematic and actually reinforces the whole problem. Could you take us on that journey?
Yeah, so Pierre Bourdieu is a French thinker. He talked about the idea, he took on this problematic of structure and agency and suggested actually that they were much more integrated than that. Instead, he talks about habitus, which is the kind of environment that we're in and the expression of both sort of like structured agency and agentic structure. So this sense that we can't be one or the other, that we, because I think it leads us down a road of debate which becomes quite polarizing, and is it the individual that should be making better choices, or is it the structures that should be more mindful? And I'm not convinced that either are the way forward, and we might think about that in different terms, whether or not we're thinking about smoking, obesity, gambling, regulation around bearing arms, all sorts of different social phenomenal debates that we might have. It becomes polarized, I think, if we think about agency and structure in those separate ways. I think we have to think about them in more integrated fashion.
The how of that, is there any suggestions of that? And then we'll move on to maybe how other disciplines can answer the how.
So one of Bourdieu's concepts is the idea of distinction, the idea that all of the things that you're exposed to in your life begin to shape who you are and shape your decision making, shape what's available to you, and these ideas become like tastes. So it's whether or not you feel comfortable in an environment. I guess we're all sitting here right now feeling relatively comfortable, I'm guessing, in the university environment, but that's because we've knowledge of it. But why did we end up in this room talking about capitalism today in the way that we are? Why are you interested? Why are you here? And why are other people off doing something different with their bank holiday? Like that's, in part, we might like to think of that as choice, that you've chosen to come here, that this is, but that choice is also shaped from way back, from and even before your existence as a data point. You step into certain environments, you step into positions. It's not that necessarily you make a choice, but then also Bourdieu is very passionate about saying that we're not just automated beings that are like puppets having our strings pulled. There is agency in there, and that stops him being too deterministic, which lots of people do say about Bourdieu. They say he's deterministic, but there is a sense that that agency does exist all the time. It's just always in a constrained fashion. And I think that's just an interesting point to link with the idea of reflexivity, which I know we'll talk about, is to the extent to which we can know ourselves or know what's happening, and that idea of the knowledge beyond the boundaries of knowledge that we hold, and how that too impacts us beyond just the knowledge that we have in place. And knowledge is not permanent, although we'd love to treat it as such. We love to make decisions off the back of it, or use it as evidence for doing a particular thing. But the knowledge is not permanent. It's always shifting. It's always outside of, its current context. At some point we thought the world was flat. It's just this idea that knowledge is a foundation on which to build everything. We ought to be problematizing that. And I would say that something like Southern theory, Rowan Connell asks us to think, think about our epistemes, think about where they're coming from, what they're built on, whether or not we should be challenging them, and being more cohesive in the ways that we present challenge, and not just leaving it to the individual.
Yeah. Southern theory is almost something that Michael briefly touched upon at the start by giving you examples from previous hunter-gatherer communities. Almost with that. But if you could also address the how of joining agency and structure, or do you think that it's a good way?
I guess one of the problems with I always struggle with Bourdieu and the kind of French structural linguistic tradition is I do feel it's a bit of a frozen system that they describe, and that the agency they describe is within a very limited range. And I think with the missing link in that is power and who has it, and who gets to define it. And that's one of the big things is often anthropology is found working on the margins, looking at smaller communities, looking at what we would consider within a data point, the anomalies. And by going to those remote places, going to the edges of things, I think you have an opportunity to see maybe some alternatives. But yeah, I guess the problem is the system is what it is, and it wields an incredible amount of power. When you start talking about regulations to try and control that power, to try and stop crass exploitation, you see a massive pushback. Every time there's even a glimmer of a discussion, for example, about raising minimum wage, everybody says all the small businesses will close. We can't afford this. We can't do that. And yet countries like Australia pay 25 Australian dollars an hour for every job as a minimum wage. They haven't collapsed, and one would say they're probably more successful right now as an economy than the UK is. And so the slight raising of the minimum wage that they've recently done, all the businesses said they're going to go out of business. They haven't. There was something in the news, I can't remember the name of it now, was that all department store went out of business. The final shop closed, and the department store put up signs saying it's the Labour government's fault. I looked at it. I always get curious. I always find these things, and I looked at the information. I looked at the actual data. They haven't made a profit for 5 years. So I don't know how they can blame the contemporary government for their woes that started at least 5 years ago. And in fact, their very problem is they can't compete with the online system. So, that one wasn't a failure of regulation. It wasn't new wages. It wasn't, and they say it was national insurance contributions went up for them. So they had to pay more to have workers. If you can't have a successful business that pays people beyond a starvation wage, then your business isn't successful, and perhaps it should fail. Where am I going with this? I don't know. Is there any agency, or are we locked in a system? I think the system has a hell of a lot of power, and so it's hard to shift. It's hard to change. Smaller businesses just get consumed by the big ones, but at the same time, the cracks are there, and you see that in the political discourse from left and right. What Donald Trump's doing in America is a reaction to the crises of capitalism. His voter base, not him so much, but his voter base is the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the impoverished working class. And so they are pushing back from a political economic spectrum of right of a right-wing perspective. They're blaming foreigners. They're doing that. You see that here with Reform Party. They're rising up. They've got the right idea. They've got the wrong target. It's not the immigrants crossing the channel that are breaking your banks. You can't find an NHS doctor because it's been underinvested in by the state, and so on and so forth. So we're fighting a system of power, and we often think that we don't have power within that. But there are 8 billion people on this planet, and there's only a few hundred billionaires. So we actually have an incredible amount of power. As Birmingham knows, the bin workers have an incredible amount of power, and they, at the loss of their wages, they're being told to accept austerity, £8,000 a year less to do the same job. And they're saying no, and they should. I think they should follow the French, and they should burn Birmingham and riot and then sort it out. I think the French got it right. When something's wrong, Paris burns. And their energy prices are a fraction of the UK's. We should be having riots in the street over the energy prices that we are forced to pay because we buy it on the international markets. And our regulatory bodies are failing us by allowing these price caps that are absurd, well above, and we are accepting it. And I think we don't have to. So.
Yeah, I will speak for the regulators. No, I think conversation on agent versus structure is really interesting. I also feel like economics in a way has been grappling with this. So if you're an economist, you will know that we have the microeconomics, we have the macroeconomics, where the microeconomics thinks about the individual economic agent. The macroeconomics think more about the system, like the broad spectrum system, how everything is coming together. Is there a clear pathway, clear answer? No, I think I would agree a little bit more with Michael. That relationship between agent and structure is a little bit fluid, and it will depend where the emphasis shifts, whether on the agent or the structure will change from time to time depending on the frameworks that we're dealing with. As we're just speaking, I was thinking more about like sort of day-to-day, when day-to-day at the CMA, for instance, when we have a problem, we do a market investigation, we want to design remedies, the question becomes, do we empower the agent or do we bring in reform that changes the structure of the market? It's not really an easy question to answer. But then an argument that comes up time and time again is that why should the agent bear the extra cost for the failing of the market? Why should the extra administrative burden fall on the everyday consumer? And these are questions that we don't, it's a messy world. We're in the system that we're in, and we don't really have clear answers to. And so we just have to navigate this as and when. Etc. So I think on this issue, I take what both of you have said. I don't really have a strong report, and I just sort of echo the idea that even in regulation, it's a thing that we try to navigate from day to day. And even as economists, we see how we try to marry the micro and the macro, thinking about unintended consequences when you alter maybe the incentives of the agent or you change the structure of the system. Yeah.
As a student in economics myself, I noticed, and having this discussion with other students, that like we split it into micro and macro, but then when we try to like purely explain which is which, we find it hard to place the line. And I think this basically Bourdieu says that as well, right? That there isn't that clear cut between agency and structure. For the rest of this panel discussion, I'd really like to push past the kind of academia's role in explaining things and try to almost experiment with what can we do and dare to say wrong things and challenge each other, I guess. If I can ask them straight to reflexivity, and this is a topic or a term that has almost different meanings in psychology and sociology, but in a sense they're talking a bit about the same thing. How do we like challenge our biases? How do we challenge the power structures? How can sociology help us do that? And can sociology help us do it alone, or does it need help from other disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I would never say that one discipline, I think, has all the answers. So
Mhm.
yes, absolutely think it needs to be interdisciplinary. I think for me, I think it's thinking about what reflexivity is. It's not just being reflexive. It goes beyond that. So it's not just thinking about the problems, but it's about being able to comprehend what the problems are, what the factors are that are inclusive of that, and recognizing that you can only ever see it really from your own perspective anyway. So again, I go back to that idea that it needs to be more community-based and not individualistic. Which I guess a sociologist would say, wouldn't they? That it's about community rather than individuals. Yeah, I think if we're being truly reflexive, we've got to maybe think about what the limitations are to that reflexivity. For a long time, you know, Western thought has dominated. Western thought has cultivated, has curated how knowledge is produced, who has it, who owns it, what they can do with it, and that keeps the knowledge base really tight. And that's why I think something like Southern theory isn't just another episteme, it's a way of thinking more reflexively about positions. It's about questioning. I think reflexivity ultimately is about that constant questioning of ourselves, of our environment, of the spaces in which we're creating knowledge and what we're doing with it. So that would be, I think that's very topical in sociology at the moment.
Could if we go down this path for a minute, like Southern theory, for example, could economics help with amplifying the voices that of non-Western thought that may challenge our capitalism or shape it in a new way?
I am thinking of a word, but it's running away from me. I sort of feel like economics thinking's definitely moved moved to a position that's open to listening to, I don't know, arguments and voices that definitely deviate from the very traditional ways of thinking about things. So we have different schools of economics that are developing and are raising questions. And again, sorry, the word is running away from me. I just don't know why I can't. But the point is, you know, we're contemporary economics has gotten to a point where we're sort of challenging our base assumptions, challenging our thinking, and definitely trying to amplify the voices of people that don't belong to the mainstream. So in a sense, I'm thinking of, I don't know if either one of you are familiar with Duflo's work on poverty in Africa. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like
No.
different ways of
Rings a bell.
approaching, yeah, different ways of approaching sort of all problems from a non-traditional economist perspective. I think the work is ongoing. I just don't know if we've gotten to a place where we can say it's like good enough or we're happy with where we are, but the ball is rolling definitely.
I think like one of these economic models or ideas is models about degrowth or that we shouldn't chase like profit forever. Michael, if I'm not wrong, you have your opinions on that topic. Could we hear
Well,
them and what degrowth is perhaps?
The idea of degrowth, I don't find it that compelling, to be honest, because it's this kind of, it seems to be a Western-led idea, and it's telling the poor parts of the world that they shouldn't develop, that they shouldn't grow their economies, they shouldn't better their lives. So there's a problem with the degrowth is they would look at the idea is that the economy doesn't have to keep growing, that you can actually have a stable system. I don't know. It's not really that compelling when you go to the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. The population is still growing there. We've not flatlined the population. So if the economy doesn't grow, it would mean real human misery. And I guess what I find more interesting is sometimes some of the post-colonial thinkers that come out, but that gets outside of the economic argument about capitalism, and it gets into things like, is democracy actually a good thing? Or are there different models of democracy that are more functional than what we've got? And it's immensely frustrating as an Africanist, is every time there's a civil war or some kind of calamity, all of these international agencies and organizations rush in and say, let's hold another election. It's like they just fell apart into a civil war. Maybe we can hold off the election. Let's get people eating. Let's get the economy fixed. We'll come back to the election in the future. Don't tell us we need a liberal democracy 6 months down the road after a civil war where the losing opposition party has got AK-47s and real solid grievances about the misery that they live within. And we keep getting told that no, the liberal model works in peace theory, and it doesn't. And one of the big problems is, again, we come back to power. Suzanne, my wife, she writes this from a post-colonial perspective about conflict and war. And she keeps getting told that she should use more theorists from the global north. She's saying, but I'm studying an African conflict. Why can't I use African thinkers? This is absurd. And the journals reject her article and say, have you considered this so-and-so? And it's like, yes, I rejected it. He's never even been to the continent. And it's absurd that this person even speaks on this topic. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that. We're pushed back constantly. There's a lot of power in that system, and to develop alternative ideas is hard to do. And degrowth, I don't think offers much as it's currently conceptualized. It's a theory coming out of the global north, where rich people are saying, "Oh, it's great. Everyone can just have a bicycle and stop traveling overseas and doing all this other stuff." And they're saying to these people that are that maybe China should deindustrialize, and you get people within that tradition even focusing on Chinese growth and saying, but they're the biggest polluter. But that's all our factories move there to make a quick buck. So all the labor in the rich parts are, and that's reform voters and all of that, are the disenfranchised. They're marginalized. They don't have alternative skill sets, training, jobs, and so there's this cracks going. They're told to just join the gig economy, you'll be fine. Service industry and all of that. It's not working.
Maybe like a critique that we could level at capitalism is that it's an impoverishment of imagination. That can you think outside? Can you imagine beyond the knowledge that you have available to you? And then that becomes really important to ask the questions of who's holding the knowledge, who has the keys to the knowledge, to what extent can knowledge be reformulated, reimagined, recreated, redemocratized?
Well, I think that's the big thing with capitalism actually emerged out of liberal thinking. And so it's a liberal theory. Capitalism is a liberal theory. People use liberal like it means left wing, and it clearly is not. It's more of a, at best, centrist position. But liberalism as kind of a big umbrella concept impacts on all these other ideas. And you're being told that these Western ideas that are connected to liberalism are what are best, or what works. And it doesn't work for the bulk of the world. And things are getting worse, not getting better for many people.
So from what I kind of taken on so far is that this system of capitalism, that's the power is what is the challenge, kind of. This power is in this whole system, and we as agents are struggling to challenge it. And then at the same time, must mention slow, that capitalism kind of reinforcingly stops us from challenging it, right? But that we sort of seem to come to an agreement that amplifying Southern work voices can be a macro response to that, almost. Would you agree with that, or?
Possibly, but at the same time, if they're part of the same system, everybody's within that same system. It's a global system, and it's everywhere. Far reach of the Kalahari. So getting their voices is important, getting their ideas is important, but whether or not they have a full alternative. And that's the big thing is, well, I don't necessarily think we need a singular alternative. There's different ways of knowing, of being, of trading, of doing business, and different economic growth that is needed in different parts of the world. So we shouldn't be looking for a singular alternative. And that's the big thing, is the idea with it. Plurality of some kind. And that's the difficult part. So
I'm going to go full circle as well, Seb, and say that at the very beginning I said that I felt like capitalism, the interest for me lies in like embodied capitalism, and I saw it more as a force. You mentioned there the word resistance, and I think if you think of like physics purely, it's the idea that like power moves from one place to another, and it will go with the the least resistance. Like for me, and I guess this is where that's where we agree around regulation, is this idea that putting resistance into the system can alter the flow of power and can therefore maybe speak to things like social justice, addressing inequalities. I still think fundamentally the system is built on rotten foundations, if I'm honest, but nevertheless, I think it is what it is, and it's very difficult to change it wholesale. I think, therefore, I do feel hopeful about what building resistance into the system can create. Foucault's idea of power and the idea that resistance is key, that it's not just a powerful hierarchy that's working upon us that we have no ability to address or redress. We can. You're smiling at me, I know about this. But there is a sense that resistance is important, and it's super important, therefore, to think in what ways is our resistance being given a platform, being elevated. And we might think about Black Lives Matter, we might think about Greta Thunberg and the work that she's done around environmental pushback, we might think about Just for Stop Oil. So we might think about kind of anti-capitalist movements, maybe, to what extent those challenge power, status quo, to what extent also, though, they are being marginalized and having opportunities to articulate those voices, to articulate a different point of view being taken from them. So, questions about how protesters are treated, to what extent our legal framework allows for challenge, to what extent our knowledge institutions allow for challenge and pushback. I'm very aware of constraints upon me in a lecturing situation that I think they go back to that habitus. They go back to that kind of, they're not physically written into any rule book, but they're tangibly there about what I can and can't speak about, or what I think we can engage in as a group, or, and a lot of that is around emergence of problems with identity politics and wider political movements, perhaps. But I suppose the take home is, I think resistance is really important. We ought to be thinking about resistance. We ought to be thinking about what allows for it.
I was just going to say, the problem with resistance, I just remember back from my undergraduate days, I was part of a kind of a Marxist group, and we would talk and meet. And there's one guy was rabid Marxist, if you will. And he said we should abolish minimum wage. We should get rid of government regulation. And I was like, why? He said, because it just forestalls the revolution. He said that the problem is, if we tinker around the edges, we try to do capitalism better. We fix this, we adjust that, we do this, but we don't fundamentally transform or change the system. And that's an interesting argument. I wouldn't want to see that, because that would see crass human suffering really, really rapidly. But at the same time, if we are just tinkering around the edges, and yet the crisis is worsening, cost of living, all of these things that we see this compounding, maybe there is something in that we should stop tinkering with the system and let it fail.
Well, if I may, not to defend the system, but just to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, Michael. So I noticed I've been talking about this idea of reflexivity. We've been talking about amplifying voices. We've been talking about alternative perspectives, and but I think the question I want to ask the panel and maybe the room is, to what end? What are we challenging, and why? Are we trying to make capitalism better? Or what are we trying to ensure? What is the objective of, do you understand what I mean? Like, what's the objective of the what's the objective of the inquiry? Are we trying to, is it to reduce inequality? Is it to ensure political stability? Because depending on what you're trying to achieve, the pathway to do that will be different. So I think I started to think when we're talking about amplifying like Southern voices, why? Because I'm from Nigeria. And when I think about Nigeria's sort of economic, political, social realities, the sort of the toolbox I'm going to open up will be very different from when I sit, at the Behavioural Insights at the CMA thinking about like the UK veterinary market. Do you understand what I mean? So I think that we can learn from each other, but I don't really know that we need to appropriate tools from one system,
No,
from one
absolutely. Yeah.
ecosystem to another.
Yeah.
And I think it also really helps us, like it helps when we define what it is that we're trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, we are here in a capitalist environment that probably appeared to solve something that it thought was the problem at the time.
Yeah.
I don't imagine that in our human lived experience, we're going to find a system that answers all our questions. Like if we adopt another, a thought experiment, let's take an X system, we don't know what it is, but it's a new system. It will have its own drawbacks, it will have its own failures. So it's like, what exactly are we trying to, what is the big end? What are we trying to achieve?
Okay.
Answer that.
Yeah, well, I guess for me, the economic argument used to be, how do we deal with scarcity? Scarcity is no longer actually a problem. We actually produce more food than the entire 8 billion people on this planet need. We in the West throw away between 30 to 40% of our food goes in the bin without being eaten, some of it not even being cooked. So there's an incredible amount of waste in this system that's supposedly efficient, and it's not. Capitalism does not engineer efficiencies. It's actually massively inefficient in many ways. Where was I? Okay, so the economic problem of scarcity has been fixed. The problem is actually one of distribution of resources and access to those resources. And I think some of the models from other parts of the world are showing that you can lift people up, and that's my real interest in doing all of this, is poverty alleviation. China's lifted 1 billion people out of poverty since 1978. And their GDP per capita is only 13,000. Why is it that was an economic thing? They said, until your GDP per capita is over 30,000, you won't lift people out of poverty. And they said, no, we're going to do something different. And they did, and they continue to do so. But I will let Will.
Yeah, we
You gave me a platform. It's
so it will be now time for the audience Q&A, which will hand over to Emily in a second. While you think of your questions, I will ask you some 3 questions that just one-word answers almost. So please get your questions ready. If we Here we go. If you scan that, you should be able to write it in, or if you want to raise your hand afterwards, you can do that as well. In the meantime, because we have many students here, if you were back in your undergrad days and you could take a module which you haven't taken before, what would it be? I'll give 5 more seconds.
Ah, economics.
Wow, very nice.
Well, my undergrad degree was in Canada, which is a liberal arts. So it was very broad. I took poetry, literature, French, economics, statistics, calculus, sciences, and anthropology. But I suppose what I would take would be another poetry module in the literature, language and literature, or maybe some more English literature, because I do a lot of reading. So,
Emike.
Yeesh, it's a little bit difficult for me. I studied economics and statistics, so I definitely scratched the itch for numbers. I would say psychology, but I ended up being a behavioral economist, so I think I also scratched that itch as well.
Covered that,
I covered that way. So seeing how I covered the base, I'll say law. I think legal frameworks are really important. Understanding them is really important.
If we could get a recommendation of what's one book, film, or podcast that has recently challenged, inspired your worldview?
This
We can start with Michael.
Okay, David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs is a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Debt, 5,000 Years
Yeah.
History.
Which is a wedge about like this thing.
Or if you want to really light reading, Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. Nice brick. So
Emike?
Yes, I'm writing. It's a book by Dan Bissamore. It's called Dead Aid. I think that's an interesting one. I also like a book by Esamoglu called Why Nations Fail. It kind of talks about like institutions and systems. I thought that was a very good read when I was a student.
Jen?
Yeah, okay, so I would say Naomi Klein, Doppelganger was a really good read for me recently. Really enjoyed that. And equally, her other book that escapes my mind at the moment. But sorry, I've got to get, there's a couple I've got to get in. Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers and The Revenge of the Tipping Point are both really accessible and very, very, very interesting. And Judith Butler, well, anything by Judith Butler, but Judith Butler, The Force of Nonviolence, I found really mind challenging.
Questions. Thank you so much for as well. Does anyone have any in-person questions that they would like to voice? Please raise your hand. Yes, and if you could please stand up and ask the questions, please.
So we talked about that we shouldn't we should look beyond singular alternatives. And we also talked about that we should go beyond Western ideas. So I was wondering if you could like share some examples of what kind of non-Western ideas we could look into ourselves or in the future. So we talked about we should do it, but we just don't know where to look or we don't know exactly what to look for. So perhaps some examples would be when we do that.
I guess that's probably for me then to jump in with it. But I would say if you're looking at oil and energy, don't follow Nigeria's case. That's a really bad example. So maybe you could learn from the negatives as well. I think that's a difficult question because you'd have to say what particular context, what is the big problem? Some of the okay.
For example, we are talking about alternative to capital. For example,
Well,
for distribution, let's say alternative to production and distribution.
Slovenia, there are still facts.
Right?
Well, yeah, is it?
Let's talk. Since you brought up non-Western.
Okay. Okay. I suppose I was going to say it's on the edge of Europe, though, isn't it? So it's more of a somewhere between that. Okay. Well, in Zambia, I've done a lot of work in the country of Zambia. In Zambia, the private property only exists within the certain urban areas where capitalist colonial penetration was greatest. So most of the land is held in trust. Now, I'm not saying we should import a chieftaincy system into the UK, but it's really quite interesting. And Dambisa Moyo would disagree with me on this because she always says it's dead capital. The land that they hold there, herself being Zambian, but what it does is the land is held in trust by, in that case, a tribal authority. But it's the idea behind it, though, is that no single individual can just carve out a piece of land and do whatever they want with it. They have to do it within a community structure and they have to respond to the community. It's got its flaws because it was damaged by colonialism and maybe it had its flaws because of power and so on. But we can look at that and say maybe there's alternatives to private ownership. We can look at communal ownership in cases where it works. Countries like Botswana, where it's very, very successful, very, very non-corrupt country that does something very, very differently. If you want to, what they're doing there with state ownership of natural resources, they won't allow any single company to own 100% of a mining resource. So their diamonds are all state mandated, state run. They play a fundamental role in that instead of just privatizing it and selling it off like Zambia did to their copper mines. But they're forced to do so by the IMF. So I think that's probably maybe a good example is Botswana's system, both of governance and resource control, where it's kept within the nation state on behalf of the people.
So that's pretty similar.
The communals, yeah. So more of a communalism instead of a communism. So,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah.
thinking that the end it type that go Western idea.
If I may,
Yeah.
Michael. So I think a good answer to your question will be, first, you do need to define the question that you're trying to answer. So you want an alternative to capitalism to answer what question particularly? What is it? Is it a question of scarcity, or is it a question of redistribution? If you don't define your question,
Let's say production and distribution.
So again, if the idea is, if you don't define your question properly, then finding an appropriate system will be difficult. Sometimes it might mean kind of appropriating. So as far as like you've kind of demanded like specific examples,
Just so we can look in.
yeah, so I can't give you specific examples, but I can sort of give you like a framework to approach a problem. Like it's sort of how you approach like any problem that you want to solve. You define the question, then you start to look for best practices around. Like so imagine I'm speaking to a room of like future policymakers, right? Define the question, you look for best practices, you listen to the stories of other jurisdictions to see what they've done. But then if all of that fails, then you sit down with a question. So for instance, being Nigerian, I will go home and I will see like we have these like women at the side of a street that kind of sell street food. And a really super Western idea to that will be like, oh, they shouldn't be there. They should be in a mall somewhere, right? And it should look, the presentation should be a certain way. But a simple answer to that could be, why does she have to leave? Like the farm is literally right behind her. If you say like, I want X and Y and I want it now, she could say, just hold on. My son has gone to the farm. He'll pick it up and bring it for you. Like there is a charm in that. So why do I have to pack that up, send her to a mall, put the corn in a bag like it is in Morrison's and sell it to somebody? Why can't I make it safe for her to be there? Why can't I empower her with an institution that actually supports and promotes her being there and allows it to become profitable for her? So sometimes like solutions develop from you trying to preserve certain aspect of a local existence or like a local way of being, as opposed to trying to make it look like something else. Does that make any sense?
I think it's a really good example. The idea of a market distribution system. I was at a copper mine in Zambia, and they'd created a whole formal market for all the women in the community to sell their produce at. And all the young men hung out in it. And the women were over there with an informal market that they had before. And they said, we didn't ask for that. Who built that? It's too small. It's too uncomfortable. The stalls are about like this high. And it was a Western style supermarket that they were hoping to impose on that area. And the women said, it's impractical. I'm there with my babies and my children. So I'm just going to put my blanket out, put my produce out. I don't need all that. I never asked for that infrastructure. And that infrastructure doesn't work for what we do here. And so they rejected it. And of course, the mine was also saying what we could do is we could get a little bit of income from that. They could rent it. They said, so no, we're not doing that. So it was a complete failure. And it does that all the time. But I'll let someone else. You go. Yeah. No?
I know the audience is getting desperate, and of course, time can't sell everybody. I mean, time is money, though. Well, I had very quick questions, and I want you guys to respond very quickly as well. Just
Okay.
sentence would be enough. Because of course, everybody has got a lot of questions. I don't want to take all the time. So, the first question: critics argue capitalism promotes individualism over the collectivism. So you call it community, but then it's more about individualism. I mean, you want to earn profit, and that's what capitalism, according to my understanding, is.
Mhm.
So how do you respond to that? Just one thing. I mean, I hope you got my question.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're asking whether or not individualism is promoted by capitalism. What could be done about that?
So yeah, there's two different things. One is individualism and other is collectivism.
Yeah.
But then capitalism is all about you earning the profit, you doing everything over the community. But I think Mihal did. I mean, is it Michael or Michael? Okay, my professor. He has the same spelling, but he told us to pronounce Mihal. So yeah, Michael. So you told about community. So I was just wondering that what.
Well, I guess, yeah, capitalism ultimately does promote the community and not the community, the individual within that, and too often to the detriment of the community. And you see that all the time in development projects, where they go in and they say, let's empower individuals and make them rich and make them wealthy. And it doesn't work in a communitarian system, and it just fails.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
The next question for you, I mean, yeah, is like you've talked about, in a university setup, you can embody knowledge, but you don't discuss knowledge. That idea just struck, I mean, it sunk in very well with me. And I was like, do you have any solutions or alternatives? How could we do that?
Oh, sounds really crass to say that I think we need to create kinder, more, it feels just like buzzwords, like more inclusive spaces, but I think that can come from reflexivity. I think we have to have and I think this is incredibly difficult to create, and I think it's part of the problem. I think that it's difficult to have safe spaces in which people can argue, debate, disagree. I think there's too much a sense of agreement, and that agreement comes in places. I find it interesting that we're being filmed at this moment, and that does shape what I'm saying, because I'm not just speaking to the people whose eyes I can look into. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about capitalism morphing into surveillance capitalism, and the fact that data points and what we say has much wider repercussions than it ever has done before. And that I don't think that always promotes safe environments for people to be able to disagree and to deconstruct and to think differently. And I think that's problematic. So I guess, and I think the problem is, the irony is that institutions like universities suggest that they are places to do that very thing. But my experience of that is that they are not always successful in doing so.
Yeah.
You mentioned reassessing the value of liberalism as an ideology. My question is, should we really reassess the value of, for example, authoritarian states as well? You mentioned China as a positive example. Would that really present a more compassionate alternative to liberalism, given like these types of countries, for example, lax attitude towards human rights?
I guess the challenge I always raise there is, how did President Xi get his job? He was elected. There's more democracy in a Chinese authoritarian system than there is in an American political system, where only a multimillionaire has an opportunity to become the chosen leader. It's a myth. It's myth making within this. And if you if you jump into the UK, same thing. If you don't speak the right discourse, if you aren't within the right frame, the democracy, if you aren't within the political party, you just get sidelined and driven out of it. It's not very democratic in this country as well. And of course, we don't even have proportional representation. So our current parliament sits with a historic low of actual public support, but they have a parliamentary majority. Reassessing authoritarian countries. Well, first of all, we come to them with our own liberal biases. When we look at China, we say they're authoritarian. We deny their whole democratic system of where President Xi started working in a rural enclave and worked his way through the system. He's got actual skills, actual talents. He rose to power because of a meritocracy. So the myth of meritocracy is in this side of things, not their side of things. Does China have problems with authoritarianism? I don't know. Ask that lady who's sitting in prison for 2 years for tweeting something recently in the UK. I think we've got our own problem with authoritarianism that's being denied. And as you just pointed out, we're being surveilled. And I've just said Birmingham should be burning. I mean, am I going to have repercussions for that? Because I say we should riot better. We should protest better. Am I going to have repercussions for that? Quite possibly, yes. I hope not. I'm being sarcastic for the power that be that out there. I'm being ironic and power. That's my defense.
Of course,
And the curtailment of discourse. Claude Eke, he's a African political scientist. He says democracy is flawed. He says it doesn't produce what it pretends to do, and the idea that authoritarianism is automatically bad. When he says, if you look at African systems of governance that are not democratic, they're often very responsive to communities. Botswana is a prime example of that. I love Botswana. Botswana has a parliamentary system they inherited from British colonialism, but those that get elected are typically village headmen, leaders, already people in positions of tribal authority within the Botswanan system, if you can use that word. They were given that by the British and they've kept it. But if you misbehave as a politician in Botswana, they will have you under a thorn tree in a Kakatla, a tribal court, and you can be recalled from Parliament. And Parliament reigns supreme according to law. But there's a lot, the community itself will not make sure you're not elected ever again if you misbehave. So corruption is incredibly low in Botswana. They're very responsive, and there's another layer of democracy that happens at the local level that is far better than what we have here. How many of us have ever even met our MPs? Even have a line to them? Some of us push. So I'll let to the next question. I hope that helps. So, yeah.
One person said, is freedom an advantage of capitalism, or is it a facet that leaves individuals defenseless against the laws of the market? For example, manipulation of needs on a market. Yeah, market.
I was just jumping very quickly there. I think everyone knows where I sit on that scale. I'd be very much for, I think it's the latter. Good answer.
Sorry, can you take the question again?
Is freedom an advantage of capitalism, or is it a facet that leaves individuals defenseless against the laws of the market?
Yeah, that's a difficult, even from an economics perspective, that's a difficult one, because if you've ever entered an online space just to shop, the choice architecture that you're faced with, you probably feel very vulnerable to and can feel helpless against, like, how the choice is presented to you, how it's pushed towards you. So I'm not really feeling like capitalism and freedom are linked on that question.
Absolutely not. Freedom has nothing to do with capitalism. We get told that it's time and time again that freedom to choose, freedom to this, and it links into free markets. Free markets lead to free democracies. It's not true. Hop into Germany, 1938, very capitalist, direct relationship between state and private capital. Not exactly a system of freedom under Nazi rule, to go to one of the most extreme examples of that, perhaps. But no, there isn't freedom. In fact, we have a lot of what we actually see as freedom, a freedom of choice, whether it's just consumer freedom, is actually means somebody's unfreedom somewhere else. Bangladeshi women sewing stuff for Primark so we can have t-shirts for £3. Zara uses slave labor in Brazil. There was a documentary done about that a number of years ago. They were outsourcing to little factories, and these factories were using slave labor. They weren't even paying their workers. Zara was made aware of this, and they said, not a problem. So the very freedoms that we often celebrate in the West are actually means great unfreedoms elsewhere. Thanks.
Moving on to our last online question that we will be announcing. Is capitalism the only way to practice democratic rights?
No.
Yeah, no opinion on this.
I guess with that,
We can end.
I think it has been a pleasure hearing all your wonderful insights, from pizza to Thai food to I'm talking about all the assumptions of capitalism economics, the challenges we have between agency and structure, the lovely positives of innovation, which receives a harsh clap back. And the dominance of Western thought. I hope this discussion was insightful to you, that it draws maybe new ideas, new ways of thinking, and I thank you very much for all of your points.
Right, so thank you guys, and thank you for the panelists for being here today, especially on the bank holiday. Thank you guys. And I wanted to say,
I'm just going to clap back to you here because you're all sat here listening, so thank you.
that we have a QR code if you are interested in joining the Economic Society as well. This is the space where we adopt an interdisciplinary approach as seen through this discussion panel and discuss relevant topics today. Therefore, if you haven't joined us, we invite you to warmly become a part of our community. To the left, the QR code, you can join the Economic Society, and then the one on the right, you can check our Instagram page and find out more about who we are.
Emily, would you mind very much if I just make the comment?
Sure.
Is that all right? I just want to say that as much as you've given up your time for this bank holiday, and as have we, I just would like to give a shout out to both Seb and Emily for arranging the event, because I think it's a brilliant example actually of like power being flipped a little bit here, and you like choosing what you wanted to talk about and to guide, and there's a lot goes into organising an event like this. There's a lot goes into shepherding academics and what they'll talk about. So I just would really like to like put our hands together for Emily for a brilliant event. Thank you for letting me be part of it.